So now we're going to talk about the first of our 4 rational choice models. And this is the market capitalism model. So those of you that are very familiar with economics, if you've taken neoclassical economics, micro, macro, anything like that, you're going to be very, very familiar with this model right off the get-go. So the first thing we want to look at in the market capitalism model is the fact that you have a socio-political environment operating in the background. It didn't quite take the way I wanted it to. So the socio-political environment basically is that kind of nexus or that tight-woven interaction between society and its elected leaders. And one of the key assumptions that we have when we use the term socio-political environment is that the people and the government are part of kind of the same train of thought. They are thinking about things exactly the same way. People delegate a degree of authority and responsibility to their governments, and their governments faithfully represent the people. Now we know in reality that's not always the case, but when it comes to these models, you have to start with some basic assumptions. As we get later on in this course, I'll teach you more about how to tweak these models and kind of change them to suit what you actually have to say. But for simplicity's sake, we assume that people and their governments work hand in hand. And as they are working hand in hand, they are in many ways setting the rules for the game. And as those rules are set, that defines the market environment. And the market environment is, for those of you that are familiar with economics, that's basically just your supply and demand curves. That is the market environment. And the market environment is a reflection of the socio-political environment. So when we look at any given socio-political environment, each of them would have their own kind of little market. So for example, the market in the United States looks very different than the market, for example, in France. And again, that's because we have different cultures, we have different governments, different governmental structures. Our peoples have different aspirations, and our markets are built to reflect those aspirations. Now, within the market, you have businesses. And businesses are assumed to operate within the constraints of the market. So the supply and demand curve exists, and businesses operate kind of within that business type equilibrium. Now, that may not always be true. Let me give a couple of examples from entrepreneurship, because what I want to show you is that it's not kind of a trickle-down effect where it's the market capitalism, the socio-political environment in the background, then the market economy, and then the business, and then that's all there is to it. Well, those of us that study entrepreneurship know that most of entrepreneurship is about how do you cheat at economics. And that's basically what you're doing. Business can reshape the market and or go straight to the socio-political environment. And let's give a couple of great examples of that in action. These are some good theories that go along with this particular model. The first, make sure you can see me. is causation. Sarasvathy came up with this particular term, as far as I know. Some other people in Austrian economics, like Israel Kirchner, also would make references to causation, although I don't believe they actually call it causation. And so the theory of causation basically says that markets fundamentally are not always in equilibrium. Sometimes there's kind of this disequilibrium. And a very smart and perceptive entrepreneur can recognize that disequilibrium, and then they can create a business. And as they create that business, they restore that market equilibrium. And their process of restoring that market equilibrium allows them to make a profit. So that's the source of profit from a causation perspective, that there's a disequilibrium in the market and you start a business to restore that equilibrium. Let's think of an example of causation and action. Have you ever seen those invent help commercials where they say, have a great idea but don't know how to commercialize it, call invent help and we'll help you get the patent attorneys and all that kind of stuff like that. That's a great example of causation and action, because those entrepreneurs say, you know what, the market is missing something. People have some sort of an unmet need that objectively exists, and I am smart enough to create some sort of a product and then follow up with a business to meet that need. Okay? So under causation, entrepreneurs are basically geniuses who can figure out something that's wrong with the market that everybody else in the economy can't figure out. Okay? So then they make a profit from market disequilibrium. So any sort of inventor working in his or her closet and then starting a business around that. In my opinion, I think YouTube is a great example of causation and action. There were a lot of products that existed before YouTube designed for music videos and things like that, but clearly there was a need there that was being unmet, and YouTube sprung up and basically satisfied that need of people clicking and watching unlimited videos. That's one example that comes to my mind. Now, kind of the quote-unquote opposite of causation is what we would call effectuation. Sarasvathy coins this term in one of her entrepreneurship articles, although she attributes it to the philosopher William James. Effectuation basically says, and I'll have some more videos on this later if you're interested in kind of this dichotomy between causation and effectuation. But effectuation basically says, well, it's not so much about working within the constraints of the market. It's not so much about an entrepreneur being a genius and being able to profit from market disequilibrium. It's about understanding kind of what people want and being flexible to that need, and in the process creating entirely new markets. Okay. So if I were to compare effectuation to something maybe from pop culture, you think about Neo, remember, from The Matrix, pardon me. So if you've seen The Matrix, you know, Neo takes that red pill, and once he takes the red pill, he understands everything in The Matrix can be bent. All the rules can be bent or broken. Well, that's very much what people in effectuation are doing. Okay? They say, you know, this regular supply and demand curve thing, it's not working for me. So as a business, I'm going to almost go straight to the people, or also political and regulatory institutions. I will peddle my business in that way, and in the process create a totally new market set. So this is the entrepreneur as an artist. Some good examples. Think of any entrepreneur that has an idea that they're going to create a market for something. My favorite example is Steve Jobs. Okay, so what Steve Jobs did, there wasn't really a market for an iPhone. It wasn't something that existed. He was actually looking at 3 different markets: mobile internet surfing, a telephone, and a music device. And so what he did is he combined those means, those things that he already had at his disposal, in a new and innovative way with the iPhone, peddled it straight to the people, and in turn created a whole new set of supply and demand curves that didn't exist before. I think he's a great example of effectuation in action. Another theory that's classic but doesn't quite match up with causation or effectuation, it's kind of its own thing, is what we would call creative destruction. So one of the scholars that's generally attributed to the creation of entrepreneurship as a field is Josef Schumpeter. He's what we would call an Austrian economist. He comes from the Austrian School of Economics, although he taught at Harvard for a number of years. And creative destruction basically said a big part of entrepreneurship is looking at a supply and demand curve and destroying it. Destroying markets that already exist and creating a brand new one. Okay? So again, he doesn't specify whether they go into the socio-political environment or anything like that. It's not really the focus of his study, but it's the fact that entrepreneurs are inherently rule breakers. That's what creative destruction is all about. So those are some kind of useful theories, but let's give a couple more that I think will be helpful. Another, I guess it's not a theory, but it's more of a key definition that you need to know within the context of the market capitalism model, is what is a market economy? Market economy basically means that individuals are no longer subsistence producers, and they take their surplus and use it for purposes of trade, and therefore markets become more important. Now, this is another key term that you need to be aware of, and that's subsistence. Subsistence basically means you only produce enough to meet your most basic needs. A great example of this is in pre-industrial societies, and even sometimes in industrialized societies that have an uneven distribution of wealth. You have a lot of people that are what we'll call subsistence farmers. Those are farmers who grow enough grain or enough cattle or whatever they're doing to satisfy basically the nutritional needs of themselves and their family members. They don't have anything left over at the end of the harvest to sell. Okay, those are subsistence farmers. Now, kind of as people evolved, we started coming to the point where now a farmer has leftover grain, leftover beef, leftover whatever at the end of the harvest, and they could take that surplus and they could trade it with their neighbors for things that they wanted. And this is kind of when markets began to arise. So this is kind of the early interpretation of the market economy. Now, a couple more theories that go along with the market capitalism model are capitalism and managerial capitalism. Okay. So first of all, you kind of have to look at the economic history to understand the difference between capitalism and managerial capitalism. But capitalism is this kind of economic ideology. It has a series of values, which include things like individuals can own their own property, they seek a profit, there is a market that promotes free competition, and there is limited government restraint in markets. I'll talk more about that in just a second. And then there is what we call managerial capitalism. And that's when a market economy is not run by owner entrepreneurs, but instead the businesses are run by salaried managers who are basically trustees. In other words, the owners allow them or they delegate running of the business for the interest of the owners. Why the difference, some of you may be asking? When the theory of capitalism came around, this was Adam Smith, we're talking about the 1700s. When he looked around Scotland and England, most of the businesses were family businesses. You maybe have someone who's a craftsman or craftswoman. Maybe they have I don't know, some family members, and the number of employees that they had in their enterprises you could probably count on your fingers and toes. That's the way a lot of businesses were run at that time. But as corporations became into preponderance, and we'll talk more about this in business history, for example, with the birth of the railroads, corporations became very, very large, and it was impossible to have, you know, the Smith Family Railroad, for example. It wasn't possible. These needs could not be met by family-sized enterprises. So there started to become managers who would run the businesses for the benefit of their owners. Now let's talk about some assumptions of this market capitalism model, because I think they're important. The first and foremost one is that this socio-political environment, particularly the political side, is very slight. Government does not really interfere in markets. In fact, government only really exists for the promotion of business. In other words, to make sure that markets run in a fair and equitable manner. And that philosophy, which is also a theory that you can use, is laissez-faire. Laissez-faire basically is a French term that means leave it be or let it be done. You know, they could have just said leave it alone theory, but as you take more and more of these lectures with me, you'll learn that people in academia think that when they call a term by something in Latin or French instead of just everyday English, it sounds more exotic and sophisticated. So that's why it's called laissez-faire instead of leave it alone theory. So laissez-faire, again, governments should not interfere or intervene in markets. Another key assumption of the market capitalism model is that individuals can save up their surplus and they can own private property. You know, they can own and buy private property based on these savings, and they can freely risk their savings in any kind of investment that they want. Now, one gentleman who's about the same time as Adam Smith was Cantillon. And Cantillon actually said, entrepreneurs are those who save money and then in turn invest those in markets. That was a very early definition of entrepreneurship. Another thing that Adam Smith assumed, which was kind of ridiculous in his time, but is actually not so ridiculous today, is that consumers are informed about all products and all prices and they make rational decisions. Now, in Adam Smith's time, that was kind of ridiculous. You know, if you're in Glasgow in Scotland, and someone tells you that 100 gallons of milk will cost you 5 pounds of silver, you're probably inclined to just go ahead and assume that's what the price is. You may not know that in Edinburgh you can get 1,000 gallons of milk for 5 pounds of silver. You wouldn't know, because you're not going to take a carriage and go all the way to Edinburgh just to inquire about the price of milk. So in those days, customers weren't really informed. And I think about even as a child growing up, one of the things that I like is antiques. And so I'd go to an antique store, and I used to love buying, like, you know, coins or stamps and, you know, old books and things like that. And, you know, I'd look at a stamp or a book or whatever, and I'd look at the price, and I'd really have no way of knowing whether I was getting a good deal or not. I'd instead just buy it, and I'd get home, and I either got a great deal or I got ripped off. But the point is, I never really had any way of knowing. Today, though, Adam Smith's assumption is actually starting to hold true because of the fact we have internet everywhere with us. Now when I go to an antique store and I wonder if that book is a good value, well, I whip out my smartphone, I start punching there on the phone, I look on the internet, look on eBay or one of these kind of websites, and I can figure out exactly how much that book is worth. And so I can make an informed and rational decision. So in Adam Smith's time it wasn't that relevant, but today it's actually becoming increasingly relevant. Another of Adam Smith's initial assumptions, which he later in life started to think maybe wasn't all that correct, was that firms exercise a degree of self-restraint. In other words, yes, it is true a firm's first and foremost goal is to make a profit, but they won't do things that are unethical, they won't cheat customers, they won't lie, those kinds of things. So there is some sort of a degree of moral restraint. Now this moral restraint is actually kind of a preliminary seed of corporate social responsibility, which we'll talk about in a couple modules from now. But that is the early the earliest definition of corporate social responsibility. Firms inherently exercise a degree of moral restraint. Furthermore, there are institutions, like we talk about financial institutions in particular, such as banks, and regulatory institutions such as laws, which exist exclusively to facilitate commerce and trade. And then another assumption that he had was that there are many homogeneous consumers and producers in competitive markets. So he assumed that all producers produced very similar products. So, one carpenter produced a table that was just like every other table that all the other carpenters produced, and all customers kind of thought about things in exactly the same way. A couple other quick notes to make about this model. So I already mentioned that government regulation should be limited, and of course, if there is some sort of unethical behavior in the market, if those firms do fail to exercise a degree of moral restraint, it is thought that in some way the markets will discipline that economic activity. So for example, if an individual firm behaves poorly, then maybe people will stop buying from them, and then that firm will have to close. In terms of corporate social responsibility, a firm behaves responsibly when it maximizes its profits. And managers, under managerial capitalism, managers have a duty to promote the interest of their owners. Now, of course, there are a variety of critiques of this model. Of course, I gave you a few already when we talked about theories from entrepreneurship. Furthermore, one of the things that's kind of a common critique of capitalism in general is the fact that the pursuit of profit winds up supplanting kind of a degree of moral restraint. People wind up becoming obsessed with the pursuit of profit instead of behaving ethically or in the interest of maintaining bonds in a community. Furthermore, while prosperity does seem to increase in capitalistic societies, there seems to be a wider and wider discrepancy between the top 1% and the 99%. So these are kind of common criticisms. Now, our next model, we will look at the dominance model, which is generally seen as an interpretation of capitalism gone awry. So if you don't really feel this model, you're going to love our next model. I'm looking forward to seeing you then.